Billionaire CEO. Victoria Kensington pointed a perfectly manicured finger at the oil-stained mechanic and ordered security to throw him out onto the street. She thought she was simply firing an insolent floor sweeper who had dared to lay hands on her multi-million-dollar Daytona prototype. She didn't know the complex twin-turbo V8 engine inside that car, and every winning chassis in her pristine garage was born entirely in his brain. By humiliating a desperate single father to protect her own corporate ego, she had just set the timer on the destruction of her racing empire. The smell of race fuel and burnt rubber was something David Caldwell could never scrub out of his skin, no matter how hard he tried. It was baked into his calluses, a permanent reminder of a life he used to own and the life he now endured. At 38, David was a ghost. To the 50-odd engineers and pit crew members at Kensington Motorsports' massive Indianapolis facility, he was just Dave, the night shift maintenance guy. He was the man who cleaned the epoxy floors, hauled away the spent Pirelli slicks, and occasionally fixed the hydraulic lifts when they jammed. He kept his head down, wore a faded blue jumpsuit with a name tag that was peeling at the corners, and never spoke unless spoken to. No one looking at the quiet, broad-shouldered man with premature gray dusting his temples would have guessed that 10 years ago, he was the most sought-after independent engine architect in the American Le Mans Series. David clocked in at 10 p.m., the familiar hum of the climate-controlled facility greeting him like a cold embrace. He walked past the rows of gleaming CNC machines and carbon fiber curing ovens. His destination was Bay 4, where the crown jewel of the Kensington Empire sat under a black silk cover, the KM99. It was a vicious, aggressive endurance racer designed to dominate the upcoming 24 hours of Daytona. Setting his mop bucket down, David pulled out his phone. The screen was cracked, but the picture of his 7-year-old daughter, Lily, was perfectly clear. She was smiling, showing a gap where her front tooth used to be, sitting in her hospital bed. Lily had been diagnosed with severe aplastic anemia 2 years ago. The medical bills had been a tidal wave that washed away everything David had built. Years ago, David had owned a bespoke engineering firm. He designed proprietary engine blocks and suspension geometries that the big teams quietly bought and slapped their own logos on. He was the secret weapon. But when his wife passed away unexpectedly and Lily got sick shortly after, David's world collapsed. He liquidated his company, sold his patents for pennies on the dollar to a holding company just to pay for Lily's bone marrow transplant, and vanished from the industry. He took the night job at Kensington because the health insurance was robust enough to cover Lily's ongoing immunosuppressant therapies, and the graveyard shift allowed him to spend his days at the children's hospital or taking her to school on her good days. "Hey, Dave, make sure you get the grease traps in Bay 4, a voice barked. David looked up. It was Richard, the lead track engineer for the KM99 program. Richard was 28, armed with a master's degree from MIT, and possessed an arrogance that usually preceded a spectacular crash on the track. "I'll get to it, Richard," David said quietly. "Make sure you do. Victoria's coming in tomorrow morning for the final dyno run before we ship the car to Florida. If there's a speck of dust on this floor, she'll have both our heads. Well, she'll have yours. I'm indispensable." Richard smirked, grabbed his sleek leather briefcase, and walked out of the garage, leaving David alone with the million-dollar machines. David watched him go, then turned his attention to the KM99. The silk cover had been pulled back slightly, exposing the rear engine bay. David couldn't help himself. He wiped his hands on a clean rag and stepped closer, looking at the intricate plumbing of the custom twin-turbo V8. The holding company that had bought his patents all those years ago had been a shell corporation for Kensington Motorsports. David knew this because he recognized the asymmetrical cylinder head design. He recognized the specific routing of the dry sump oil system. It was his design. The KM99 was powered by a modified version of his magnum opus, an engine he had conceptualized in a notebook while sitting by his wife's hospice bed. Kensington had taken his blueprint, enlarged the displacement, and bolted on 2 massive Borg-Warner turbos. It was a beautiful machine. But as David stared at the wastegate linkages and the fuel rails, he frowned. The modifications Richard and his team had made were clumsy. They had completely misunderstood the thermal dynamics of the block he had designed. "You're going to choke," David whispered to the car, running a rough finger over the cold carbon fiber intake manifold. "They've got your timing advanced too far, and your exhaust headers are too restrictive. You're going to burn up cylinder number 7. He knew it as surely as he knew his own name. But he was just the janitor. He picked up his mop, turned his back on his stolen masterpiece, and went to work cleaning the grease traps. Lily needed her medication this week. That was all that mattered. The next morning, the atmosphere in the Kensington Motorsports facility was electric with a toxic blend of adrenaline and sheer panic. Victoria Kensington had arrived. At 32, Victoria had inherited the company from her late father, a legendary racer who had built the brand from scratch. Victoria, however, was not a racer. She was a venture capitalist in a tailored suit. She viewed motorsports entirely through the lens of profit margins, brand syndication, and return on investment. She was strikingly beautiful, ruthlessly intelligent, and universally feared. Under her leadership, Kensington had fired veteran mechanics in favor of data analysts. To Victoria, a car wasn't a soul, it was a spreadsheet. David was finishing his shift, gathering his trash bags near the rear exit, when the entourage swept onto the factory floor. Victoria walked at the front, her heels clicking sharply against the epoxy. Behind her trailed Richard, looking uncharacteristically pale, holding a tablet with trembling hands. "The numbers are unacceptable, Richard," Victoria's voice cut through the hum of the garage. It was cold and precise. "We are 2 weeks out from Daytona. The board has poured $40 million into the KM99 program, and you are telling me it can't survive a 6-hour simulated dyno run without dropping power?" "Ms. Kensington, it's a thermal anomaly," Richard stammered, frantically swiping on his tablet. "The Motec telemetry shows a massive heat spike in the right cylinder bank after 4 hours of sustained load. The engine management system pulls timing to save the block, which is why we're losing 80 horsepower. We've redesigned the cooling ducts. We've upgraded the radiator core." "I don't pay you to give me anatomy lessons on a failing engine," Victoria snapped, stopping right in front of Bay 4. "I pay you to win. If this car DNFs at Daytona, Porsche and Ferrari will laugh us out of the GT class. Fix the heat spike." David, lingering near the disposal bins, paused. He looked over at the crowd surrounding the car. They were going to hook the KM99 up to the chassis dynamometer right now for a live test. "We are running out of options, Victoria," Richard said defensively. "The block architecture is fundamentally flawed. We bought the patents for this engine geometry years ago from some defunct indie company. I told your father it was a mistake to base our flagship car on a junkyard design. The block can't handle the boost we're throwing at it." David's jaw tightened. Junkyard design. His hands curled into fists inside his thick rubber gloves. "Start it up," Victoria ordered, crossing her arms. "I want to see what $40 million of failure looks like." The technicians scrambled. The massive extractor fans in the dyno cell whirred to life. A mechanic climbed into the cockpit of the KM99 and hit the ignition. The V8 barked to life with a violent, earth-shaking roar. It idled with a menacing, lumpy cadence. Even from 30 feet away, David could feel the vibration in his chest. To Victoria and Richard, it sounded like raw, unbridled power. To David, who had birthed the geometry of those firing cylinders, it sounded like a dying animal. The dyno operator engaged the load. The mechanic in the car brought the revs up. 4,000, 5,000, 7,000 revolutions per minute. The scream of the engine echoed off the acoustic panels. David closed his eyes and listened. Beneath the shriek of the turbos and the roar of the exhaust, he heard it. A faint, rhythmic hesitation. A harmonic imbalance. "It's not the block," David thought, his mind visualizing the internal components moving at thousands of times per second. "It's the harmonics of the flat plane crankshaft interacting with the scavenge pumps. The oil is aerating at high RPM. The lifters on cylinder 7 are starving for lubrication. The friction is creating the heat spike." He opened his eyes. On the massive overhead monitors displaying the live telemetry, the temperature graph for the right cylinder bank was already climbing into the red zone. "Shut it down!" Richard yelled over the headset. "We're hitting 240 degrees on the coolant. Oil temps are critical." The engine whined down, spitting unburnt fuel from the side exit exhausts with a series of loud pops. The garage fell into a tense, heavy silence, broken only by the ticking of cooling metal. Victoria stared at the monitor, her expression unreadable. She slowly turned to Richard. "You have 24 hours, she said, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly quiet register. "If this car cannot hold maximum power on the dyno tomorrow morning, you are fired, Richard, and I will scrap this entire engine program and buy customer motors from Cosworth." "Victoria, be reasonable," Richard protested. "We can't re-engineer the entire oiling system in a day." "Then you better update your resume," she replied, turning on her heel and marching out of the bay. The team collapsed into a panic. Richard began screaming at his engineers, ordering them to strip the car down and look for blockages in the cooling system. They were looking in the wrong place. They were treating the symptom, not the disease. David picked up his trash bags and walked out the back door into the cold morning air. He clocked out, got into his rusted 2004 Honda Civic, and drove to the hospital. That afternoon, he sat beside Lily's bed. She was coloring in a book, her pale skin a stark contrast to her bright hospital gown. "Daddy, are your hands okay?" she asked, her small fingers reaching out to touch the dark, permanently stained calluses on his palms. "They're fine, sweetheart. Just working hard," David said, forcing a smile as he stroked her hair. "You smell like race cars," she giggled. "Did you get to drive one today?" "No, monkey. Daddy just sweeps the floors around them." "I bet you could build a faster car than all of them," she said with the absolute, unquestioning faith only a child possesses. David felt a lump form in his throat. "Maybe one day, kiddo. When you're all better, we'll build a go-kart together. Just you and me." As she fell asleep, David stared out the hospital window at the sprawling city. He thought about the KM99. He thought about Richard's arrogant dismissal of his life's work. They were going to destroy his engine. They were going to rip it out and throw it in the trash, labeling it a failure, all because a Harvard-educated data jockey couldn't read the soul of the machine. David looked at his sleeping daughter. He needed this job. He couldn't risk getting fired. But as the sun set over Indianapolis, a quiet, desperate pride began to burn in his chest. It was 2:15 a.m. The Kensington Motorsports facility was dead silent. The engineering team had worked until midnight, tearing apart the KM99's cooling system, replacing radiators, and wrapping the exhaust headers in expensive thermal shielding. They had put it all back together, exhausted and defeated, praying that their superficial fixes would magically solve the deep-rooted mechanical flaw for Victoria's test in the morning. David was alone on the floor. He pushed his janitor's cart toward Bay 4. He parked the cart, looked up at the security cameras, and mentally calculated their blind spots. He had spent 2 years cleaning this floor. He knew exactly where the lenses couldn't see. He positioned his tall cleaning cart to block the view of the engine bay from the main camera above the bay doors. From the bottom of his trash barrel, hidden under a pile of discarded paper towels, David pulled out a battered red snap-on roll-up tool pouch. It was the only thing he had kept from his old life. He walked over to the KM99 and clicked on a small magnetic LED work light, attaching it to the carbon fiber strut brace. "All right," David whispered, staring down into the belly of the beast. "Let's fix you." He didn't touch the cooling system. He went straight for the dry sump oil pump mounted low on the side of the engine block. Working with a speed and precision that bordered on surgical, David's hands flew across the engine. He unbolted the pressure relief valve on the scavenge stage of the pump. Just as he had suspected, Richard's team had installed a high-pressure spring, thinking more oil pressure equated to better cooling. They were dead wrong. The excessive pressure at high RPMs was cavitating the oil, turning it into a frothy mix of air and fluid that couldn't lubricate the valve train properly. David reached into his pouch, pulled out a small file, and carefully modified the internal shim of the relief valve, bleeding off exactly 14 pounds of pressure. Next, he moved to the top of the engine. He popped the covers off the timing gears. Richard had advanced the timing to chase peak horsepower, oblivious to the fact that it was causing micro-detonations in the cylinders, contributing to the massive heat spikes. Using a custom-machined wrench he had brought from home, David retarded the cam timing by 2 degrees. Finally, he rerouted the vacuum lines going to the waste gates of the Borg-Warner turbos. He bypassed the electronic boost controller's factory safety loop, setting it up the way he had originally designed it, mechanical, analog, and perfectly balanced. For 2 hours, David was no longer a janitor. He was a maestro conducting a symphony of titanium, aluminum, and steel. The grease on his hands felt like a baptism. For the first time in years, he felt alive. At 4:30 a.m., he torqued the last bolt, wiped down the engine bay to remove any trace of his fingerprints, and packed away his tools. He lowered the black silk cover back over the car, packed his cart, and went back to mopping the floors as if nothing had happened. By 7 a.m., the garage was buzzing again. Richard looked like he hadn't slept, his eyes bloodshot as he barked orders at his team to prep the car for the dyno. At 7:30 a.m., Victoria Kensington arrived. She carried a cup of black coffee and wore an expression that suggested she was ready to execute someone. "Is it ready?" she demanded, not even offering a greeting. "Yes, Victoria. We've done everything we can," Richard said, his voice trembling slightly. David was near the exit, holding his time card, about to clock out, but he didn't. He lingered by the time clock, his heart pounding against his ribs. He had to know if it worked. "Spin it up," Victoria commanded. The dyno cell was sealed. The operator fired the engine. Immediately, the difference was palpable. The violent, lumpy idle from yesterday was gone, replaced by a smooth, terrifyingly crisp bark. It sounded tighter, lethal. "Bring it to load," Richard said into his headset, staring at his monitor. The RPMs climbed. 5,000. 6,000. 8,000 RPMs. The scream of the twin turbos shook the glass of the dyno cell. Victoria stepped closer to the monitors. "Temps!" Richard stared at the screen, his mouth falling open. He tapped the glass, confused. "Oil temp is holding steady at 215. Coolant is pegged at 190. The heat spike, it's gone." "Power?" Victoria asked, her eyes narrowing. We gained 40 horsepower. It's making 810 at the wheels, and the curve is perfectly flat. It's running perfectly. Better than perfectly." Richard looked utterly bewildered. He looked back at his engineers who were shrugging in disbelief. A rare, razor-thin smile touched Victoria's lips. "Whatever you did last night, Richard, it worked. The program survives. Prep it for transport to Daytona." Richard, recovering quickly, puffed out his chest. "Thank you, Victoria. I told you my thermal shielding matrix just needed some tweaking. It was a brilliant fix, if I do say so myself." By the exit, David let out a long, quiet breath. The engine was saved. His creation would race. He turned around to punch his time card. "You there?" The sharp, authoritative voice cut across the room. David froze. Victoria Kensington was marching toward him, her piercing green eyes locked onto his hands. David looked down. In his haste to pack his tools, he hadn't fully scrubbed the thick, black molybdenum grease from his knuckles and underneath his fingernails. Janitors who mop floors don't get moly grease ingrained in their skin. Victoria stopped 2 feet from him, looking him up and down with profound disgust. She glanced over at the security card he had used. She noticed how the wheels were perfectly aligned with the blind spot of the camera. "What is your name?" she demanded. "David, ma'am." "David?" She gestured to his hands. "Why do you have high-temperature assembly lube on your hands, David? You're the night shift cleaner." I was fixing the hydraulic pump on lift number 3. David lied, his voice steady. Victoria's eyes narrowed. She didn't become a billionaire by being stupid. She looked at Richard, who was now walking over, looking confused. "Richard, did lift number 3 need servicing?" she asked. "No, Victoria. It's brand new," Richard said, glaring at David. "What were you doing touching the equipment, Dave?" Victoria looked back at David. She noticed the way he stood, not cowed or submissive, but with a quiet, solid dignity. It infuriated her. "I don't know what you were doing near my prototype," Victoria said, her voice like ice. "Maybe you were trying to steal parts. Maybe you were taking pictures for Porsche, but I do not tolerate liabilities." "I didn't steal anything," David said, his voice hardening. "I just cleaned the floors." "Not anymore, you don't," Victoria snapped. "Security!" 2 large security guards in black polo shirts stepped forward immediately. "Miss Kensington, wait," David said, desperation finally bleeding into his voice. "I need this job. My daughter—" "I am not running a charity," Victoria interrupted, turning her back on him. "Escort him off the premises. If he tries to take anything from his locker, call the police." "You don't understand." David raised his voice, stepping forward. One of the guards shoved him back hard against the wall. "That car! Richard doesn't know what he's doing. If you run it at Daytona, they won't know how to tune the telemetry for the banking." Richard laughed out loud. "The janitor is giving me track advice. Get him out of here." "I built that engine!" David shouted, fighting against the guards as they grabbed his arms. "The block architecture, it's mine!" Victoria paused, looking over her shoulder. She let out a dry, mocking chuckle. "Delusional, get him out, now." The guards dragged David backward through the double doors. He was shoved out into the freezing Indianapolis morning, stumbling onto the concrete pavement. One of the guards tossed a small cardboard box containing his jacket and his red snap-on tool pouch onto the ground next to him. The heavy steel door slammed shut, locking with a definitive, echoing click. David stood alone in the parking lot. The cold wind bit through his thin shirt. He picked up his tool pouch, dusting off the dirt. He had saved their car. He had given them the key to winning Daytona. And in return, Victoria Kensington had taken away the only thing keeping his daughter alive. As he walked back to his rusted car, David's desperation slowly metamorphosed into something else. Something cold. Something sharp. He pulled out his cracked phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in 3 years. A number belonging to a man in Germany who ran the motorsport division for a company whose logo was a silver star. The phone rang twice before a gruff voice answered. "Heinrich speaking." David looked back at the massive Kensington Motorsports logo on the side of the building. "Heinrich," David said, his voice stripped of all emotion. "It's David Caldwell. You told me 3 years ago that if I ever wanted to build a giant killer, I should call you." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "David!" The German's voice shifted from professional to shocked. "The ghost speaks. I thought you were done with racing." "I was," David replied, getting into his car and starting the sputtering engine. "But I just got fired, and I need to build a car that will destroy Kensington Motorsports at Le Mans." The private terminal at Indianapolis International Airport was a far cry from the grease-stained floors of Kensington Motorsports. David sat in a plush leather chair, nursing a black coffee that tasted like burnt copper in his anxious mouth. Across the mahogany table sat Heinrich Adler, the director of global motorsports for one of Germany's most formidable automotive giants. Heinrich was a man built like a cinder block, with sharp blue eyes that missed absolutely nothing. Heinrich looked at the crumpled, oil-stained notebook David had slid across the table. He opened it carefully, as if the pages were lined with explosives. For 10 minutes, the only sound in the private lounge was the ticking of a Patek Philippe watch on Heinrich's wrist and the rustle of graph paper. "You are insane, David," Heinrich finally whispered, looking up. There was a profound reverence in his heavy German accent. "This engine architecture, you are running a hot V configuration, but with a reverse-flow cylinder head? The thermal management required for this would melt a standard block in 3 minutes." "It's not a standard block," David replied, leaning forward, his voice low and urgent. "It uses a proprietary beryllium aluminum alloy matrix. I designed the cooling jackets to use phase change fluid dynamics. It doesn't just manage the heat, Heinrich. It utilizes it to pre-spool the secondary turbine. It eliminates turbo lag completely. It will rev to 10,000 revolutions per minute, produce 950 horsepower, and it will run for 24 hours straight, without degrading a single percentage point in efficiency." Heinrich stared at the schematics. "The KM99 that Kensington is fielding is a dinosaur compared to this," David interrupted. "They are running my old Phase 1 blueprint. They think it's a masterpiece. It's a stepping stone. This new engine. This is the executioner." Heinrich closed the notebook and folded his massive hands on the table. "My board of directors has authorized me to offer you a blank check. We have been trying to win Le Mans outright for a decade. If this engine does what you say, we will fund the entire prototype program around it. We will call it the Adler Viper. But you vanished, David. You sold your patents and became a ghost. Why now? Why come back with a vengeance?" David reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded photograph of Lily in her hospital bed. He placed it on top of the notebook. "Because a billionaire in a tailored suit just fired me from my night job as a janitor, and my daughter's insurance gets cut off at the end of the month," David said, his jaw tightening so hard it ached. "I don't want a blank check, Heinrich. I don't care about the money or the fame. Here are my terms." David pulled out a single sheet of paper and slid it forward. The Caldwell contract. Total medical coverage. Adler Werke will assume 100% of the financial responsibility for Lily Caldwell's medical care, effective immediately. The best care. She is to be transferred to the premier pediatric oncology and hematology center in Munich, traveling via private medical charter. Autonomy. I am the sole director of engineering for the hypercar program. I choose the chassis, I choose the aero package, and I choose the drivers. No corporate interference. Anonymity. My name does not appear on any press release until the car crosses the finish line at Le Mans. Heinrich read the list, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his weathered face. He didn't even consult his legal team. He pulled a Mont Blanc pen from his breast pocket and signed the bottom of the page. "Pack your bags, David," Heinrich said, extending a hand. "We are going to Germany, and we are going to build a monster." January in Florida was deceptively bright. The Rolex 24 at Daytona was the ultimate proving ground for endurance racing, a grueling marathon that punished both man and machine. In the lavish, climate-controlled Kensington Motorsports hospitality suite suspended above the pit lane, Victoria Kensington was holding court. She held a flute of Dom Perignon, accepting congratulations from wealthy sponsors and board members. Down on the track, the KM99 was a silver and blue blur, leading the prototype class by a commanding 3 laps. It was the 18th hour of the race. The sun was rising, casting long golden shadows across the 31-degree banking of the Daytona International Speedway. "It's a masterstroke, Victoria," an older board member beamed, clinking his glass against hers. "40 million well spent. Richard is a genius. The engine hasn't missed a beat." Victoria smiled, a cold, satisfied expression. "I told you, gentlemen, you don't need passion to win races. You need ruthless efficiency and data. We eliminated the human error." Down in the pit box, however, the atmosphere was far less celebratory. Richard sat glued to the telemetry screens, sweat dripping down his neck despite the cool morning air. The engine temps were perfect, exactly as they had been ever since that miraculous morning on the dyno. But something else was going horribly wrong. "Richard, we have a problem," the lead data analyst said, pointing a shaking finger at a secondary monitor. "Lateral G-forces on the high banking are spiking." "So, it's Daytona. The banking is steep," Richard snapped, wiping his forehead. "No, look at the oil pressure trace," the analyst insisted. "Every time the car hits turn 3 on the banking, the oil pressure drops by 30%. The dry sump scavenge pumps are fighting the lateral Gs. The oil is pooling in the left side cylinder heads." Richard's blood ran cold. He remembered the shouting match in the factory. He remembered the janitor fighting the security guards. "If you run it at Daytona, they won't know how to tune the telemetry for the banking." The janitor's desperate warning echoed in Richard's mind, like a death knell. Richard hadn't adjusted the electronic mapping for the variable G-loads of the banking because he didn't know how. The engine's internal fluid dynamics were so complex, so foreign to him, that he had assumed the dyno tune was universally applicable. "Radio the driver," Richard panicked. "Tell him to back off the pace. Keep it under 6,000 revolutions per minute on the banking." "If he backs off, the Cadillacs will eat our 3-lap lead in an hour," the team manager argued. "Do it or the engine explodes," Richard screamed. It was too late. On the massive television screens in the hospitality suite, Victoria watched as her crown jewel screamed into turn 3 at 190 miles per hour. Suddenly, a violent puff of blue and black smoke erupted from the rear louvers of the KM99. The crowd in the suite gasped. Victoria's champagne glass paused halfway to her lips. The onboard camera showed the driver frantically fighting the steering wheel as the rear tires locked up, soaked in their own boiling oil. The multi-million-dollar prototype spun wildly, skipping across the asphalt before slamming violently rear first into the safer barrier. Carbon fibers shattered like glass, scattering across the track. Silence fell over the Kensington hospitality suite. The golden morning light suddenly felt harsh and unforgiving. Victoria stared at the screen. Her reflection ghosted on the glass. The car was dead. The engine, the heart of her empire, was a smoldering ruin. She turned on her heel and marched out of the suite, moving with a terrifying, silent rage. When she reached the pit box, the mechanics were standing in stunned silence. Richard was sitting with his head in his hands. "Explain!" Victoria demanded, her voice cutting through the noise of the passing race cars. Richard looked up, his face pale, tears of frustration in his eyes. Oil starvation. The lateral G's on the banking. The scavenge pumps couldn't clear the cylinder heads fast enough. The bearings spun. The engine seized. Victoria's eyes narrowed. You told me the dyno test proved the engine was flawless. You told me you fixed the oiling issue. I didn't, Richard whispered, the truth finally breaking him. I didn't fix it. Then who did? Victoria's voice dropped to a dangerous octave. Richard swallowed hard, looking away. When we came in that morning, someone had re-shimmed the relief valves. Someone retarded the cam timing. They bypassed the electronic boost controller. It was a mechanical genius, Victoria. I took the credit because I didn't know who did it, and you were going to fire me. Victoria felt a cold knot form in her stomach. Her mind flashed back to the morning before the race. The security camera blind spots, the red tool pouch, the molybdenum grease on the hands of the quiet, broad-shouldered man with the dying daughter. I built that engine. The block architecture, it's mine! She had fired him. She had thrown him out onto the street. Get me my head of security, Victoria ordered, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and a sudden, horrifying realization. I want the files on the night shift maintenance crew. I want the name of the man I fired. 6 months later, June, the Circuit de la Sarthe, France. The 24 Hours of Le Mans is not just a race. It is a crucible where automotive legends are forged and broken. The air in the French countryside buzzed with the anticipation of 300,000 fans. Kensington Motorsports had limped into Le Mans. The Daytona disaster had cost them millions in sponsor pullouts. The board of directors had given Victoria an ultimatum: win the GT hypercar class at Le Mans, or she would be forced to step down as CEO. Victoria had spent the last 6 months aggressively hunting for David Caldwell. When she finally learned who he truly was, the legendary independent architect whose patents her father's shell company had ruthlessly acquired, she had felt a sickening wave of vertigo. She had sent private investigators, lawyers with lucrative settlement offers, and personal letters. All returned undelivered. The man had vanished from the United States, taking his sick daughter with him. Now, standing in the Kensington garage, Victoria felt a desperate, clawing anxiety. They had rebuilt the KM99. They had hired a team of high-priced consultants to decipher David's architecture and fix the telemetry for Le Mans. But without the ghost in the machine, the car felt hollow. Across the pit lane, a massive crowd of journalists and photographers was swarming the garage of Adler Verke. The German giant had been highly secretive about their new entry. They hadn't raced it in any of the preliminary World Endurance Championship rounds. They had just shown up at Le Mans with a matte black prototype covered in a tarp, refusing to release technical specifications. Victoria, you need to see this, her new lead engineer said, handing her a tablet. It was a live feed of the WEC press conference. Heinrich Adler was standing at a podium, looking incredibly smug. Ladies and gentlemen, Heinrich's voice boomed over the PA system. For years, Adler Verke has sought the ultimate expression of internal combustion and aerodynamic synergy. Today, we are not just unveiling a car, we are unveiling a reckoning. I present to you the Adler Viper. The tarp was pulled back in the pit lane. The flashbulbs erupted like a strobe light. Victoria stared at the screen. The Adler Viper was terrifyingly beautiful. It didn't look like a race car. It looked like a fighter jet carved from raw obsidian. It was shockingly low, with aggressive, sweeping aerodynamic channels that defied conventional design. But a car is only as good as its creator, Heinrich continued. For this project, we brought in a man whose genius has been criminally underappreciated by the American racing establishment. I would like to introduce the Chief Director of Engineering for the Viper program. From the shadows of the garage, a man stepped forward into the flashing lights. He wasn't wearing a faded blue janitor's jumpsuit. He was wearing a crisp, tailored black team shirt with the silver Adler Verke logo on the chest. His hair was neatly trimmed, the premature gray at his temples giving him an air of distinguished authority. He looked healthy. He looked dangerous. Victoria dropped the tablet. The screen cracked on the concrete floor. It was David Caldwell. My God, her engineer whispered, staring at the shattered tablet. Is that the guy who used to mop the floors? Victoria couldn't speak. Her throat was tight with a sudden, suffocating panic. She watched as a reporter shoved a microphone toward David. Mr. Caldwell, the rumors are that this engine utilizes a completely revolutionary phase change cooling system. Can you confirm? David looked directly into the camera. For a fleeting second, Victoria felt as though he was looking straight through the lens, across the Atlantic, and directly into her soul. I can confirm that the Adler Viper is powered by a proprietary beryllium alloy V8, David said, his voice calm, confident, and lacking any of the desperation he had shown in the Kensington parking lot. It was built from scratch. It has no inherited flaws, no stolen architecture, and absolutely no compromises. We aren't here just to participate, gentlemen. We are here to dismantle the competition. And your daughter, Mr. Caldwell? Another reporter shouted over the din. We heard she was undergoing experimental treatment in Munich. How is she? A genuine, radiant smile broke across David's face, a stark contrast to the cold engineer who had just spoken. Lily is in full remission. She's currently sitting in the team VIP suite, complaining that the pit lane is too loud. She is the reason this car exists. Victoria felt her legs go weak. She leaned against the cold steel of her own toolbox. She had thought she was protecting her company by firing an insubordinate janitor. Instead, her arrogance had driven the greatest engineering mind of a generation directly into the arms of her biggest rival. She hadn't just lost a brilliant mechanic. She had funded the creation of her own destruction. Fire it up, David's voice echoed from the broadcast. The Adler Viper's engine ignited. It didn't roar. It shrieked. The sound was an ungodly, high-pitched wail that resonated deep in the chest cavity, sounding more like an F-16 on full afterburner than a V8 engine. The sheer violence of the idol shook the cameras recording it. It was a sound that promised absolute, uncompromising violence on the track. Victoria looked back at her own car, the KM99. The $40 million machine suddenly looked heavy. It looked obsolete. The 24 hours of Le Mans was about to begin, and Victoria Kensington realized with absolute certainty that she had already lost. The French tricolor flag dropped at exactly 4 p.m., unleashing a mechanical thunderstorm that shook the very bedrock of the French countryside. 62 of the world's most advanced racing machines surged forward toward the Dunlop curve, a multicolored tidal wave of carbon fiber, raw horsepower, and desperate ambition. In the Kensington Motorsports pit box, Victoria stood rigid, her eyes glued to the bank of telemetry monitors. Her new track engineer, a frightened-looking man named Preston, who had replaced the disgraced Richard, was frantically calling out tire temperatures and sector times. Pace is good, Victoria, Preston stammered, adjusting his headset. The KM99 is holding P2. We are trailing the Toyota by 1.2 seconds. Oil temps are stable. The new thermal wrapping is holding. Victoria didn't answer. Her gaze bypassed her own car's data and fixed entirely on the timing screen showing the overall leaderboards. She was looking for the matte black arrowhead of the Adler Viper. She didn't have to wait long. As the hypercar pack tore out of the Tertre Rouge corner and onto the legendary Mulsanne Straight, a terrifying 3.5-mile stretch of public highway closed off for the race, the true hierarchy of the engineering world was violently established. The onboard camera of the KM99 showed the rear wing of the leading Toyota. Suddenly, a shadow eclipsed the camera's view. The Adler Viper didn't just pass the KM99, it annihilated it. The black prototype slipped out of the slipstream with the terrifying, silent efficiency of a predator. While the KM99's engine roared in a strained, guttural struggle against aerodynamic drag, the Viper's bespoke beryllium V8 unleashed that ungodly, high-pitched shriek. It blew past Victoria's $40 million crown jewel as if the KM99 were dragging an anchor. What was that? Victoria gasped, her manicured nails digging into the edge of the telemetry desk. Preston, what is their top speed on the straight? Preston tapped his keyboard, his face draining of color. Ms. Kensington, the speed trap at the first Mulsanne chicane just clocked the Adler Viper at 226 miles per hour. That's impossible. They have too much downforce to run that fast. The drag penalty should cap them at 210. Across the pit lane, in the immaculate white and silver garage of Adler Werke, David Caldwell stood with his arms crossed, watching the same screens. He wore a headset, but he wasn't screaming orders. He was a portrait of absolute, zen-like calm. Aerodynamic stall achieved on the rear diffuser, David. His lead aerodynamicist reported with a grin. The exhaust gases from the phase change cooling system are blowing perfectly into the underbody tunnels. At 200 miles an hour, it's artificially stalling the drag. It's working exactly as you modeled it. Keep the drivers on target, David replied softly into his mic. Tell Klaus to short shift out of Mulsanne Corner. We don't need to stress the gearbox yet. We have 23 hours to go. Let's break their spirits before we break our equipment. David turned away from the monitors and walked to the back of the garage. Behind a soundproof glass partition, the Adler VIP suite had been transformed into a comfortable lounge. Heinrich Adler was sitting in a plush armchair, reading a German newspaper. Next to him, curled up on a leather sofa with a blanket and an iPad, was Lily. Her color had returned. The dark, sunken circles under her eyes were gone. The brutal, life-draining pallor of her illness had been replaced by the soft, rosy flush of a healthy child. The premier medical team in Munich had achieved what the underfunded piecemeal treatments in Indianapolis never could. David pressed his hand against the glass. Lily looked up, saw him, and offered a massive, gap-toothed smile, pressing her small hand against the glass to meet his. David closed his eyes, taking a deep, shuddering breath. For 2 years, his heart had lived in a state of permanent, icy terror. Now, feeling the warmth of his daughter's smile and the thunderous vibration of his masterpiece dominating the track outside, the ice, finally, began to melt. He had already won. The race was just a formality. By the 6th hour of the race, the sun began to set, painting the French sky in bruised shades of purple and burnt orange. The Adler Viper had lapped the entire GT hypercar field. It was a humiliating, unprecedented display of dominance. In the Kensington suite, the atmosphere was a funeral dirge. The wealthy investors who had clinked champagne glasses at Daytona were now glaring at Victoria. The silence in the room was thicker than the smell of race fuel outside. "They are toying with us, Victoria," a senior board member said, his voice laced with venom. "They are running 2 seconds a lap faster than our absolute qualifying pace, and they aren't even pushing. Caldwell built them a spaceship." "We are holding second place," Victoria countered, though her voice lacked its usual titanium edge. "Le Mans is a race of attrition. A car that fast cannot possibly survive 24 hours. The Adler engine will grenade. The phase change system is too complex. When it fails, we will be there to inherit the lead." "You better pray it fails," the board member whispered. "Because if that janitor you fired crosses the finish line first, the board will have your resignation on my desk by Monday morning." Victoria turned back to the window, watching the glowing brake rotors of the cars diving into the Ford chicane. Her reflection in the glass looked hollow. She was a woman who had spent her entire life worshiping spreadsheets, data analytics, and ruthless corporate efficiency. She had quantified everything. But as she watched the Adler Viper tear through the gathering darkness, she realized the terrifying truth. She couldn't quantify David Caldwell's vengeance. She couldn't put a metric on a father's desperate love, or the raw, unfiltered genius born from suffering. She was fighting a ghost, and the ghost was completely immune to her power. Midnight at Le Mans is an abyss. The track plunges into pitch blackness, illuminated only by the piercing LED headlights of the cars and the glowing orange discs of carbon ceramic brakes. Exhaustion begins to rot the minds of the drivers and the pit crews. Mistakes multiply. The circuit, winding through dense forests, becomes a claustrophobic tunnel of speed and terror. At 1 a.m., the radar screens in every pit box flared with a terrifying red bloom. "Weather alert!" Preston shouted in the Kensington garage, panic raising the pitch of his voice. "Massive storm cell moving over the Porsche curves. It's going to be a torrential downpour, but only on Sector 3. The rest of the track is bone dry." This was the legendary Le Mans microclimate, the ultimate nightmare for a race engineer. Half the track required slick tires for maximum speed, while the other half required grooved wet tires to prevent catastrophic hydroplaning. "Bring our car in! Put it on full wets!" Victoria ordered, her heart hammering against her ribs. "If we put it on wets, The dry sections will shred the rubber in 3 laps, Preston argued, his hands hovering over the radio button. The tires will overheat and delaminate. If we leave it on slicks, the driver will put it into the wall at 150 miles an hour, Victoria screamed back, her corporate veneer completely shattering. Make a decision, Preston. But Preston froze. He stared at his algorithms, waiting for the computer to give him the answer. But the computer didn't know how wet the track actually was. It didn't know the courage of the driver. It only knew historical data, and historical data was useless in the chaotic violence of the present moment. Preston! Victoria yelled. Before he could push the radio button, the broadcast monitors flared with chaos. The KM99, caught out on slick tires in the suddenly soaked Porsche curves, lost traction. The rear end snapped out. The driver fought the slide, wrestling the steering wheel, but physics was unforgiving. The silver and blue prototype spun 360 degrees, clipping the tire barrier with its rear wing assembly. Carbon fiber exploded into the night. No! Victoria slammed her fist onto the telemetry desk. He's still rolling, Preston yelled, finally finding his voice. He's limping back to the pits. Rear wing is gone. Left rear suspension is damaged, but we can fix it. It's going to be a 20-minute stop. 20 minutes in the pits at Le Mans was an eternity. It was a death sentence. As the shattered KM99 crawled down the pit lane, sparks showering from its dragging underbody, Victoria looked across the tarmac toward the Adler Verka garage. She expected to see panic over there as well. She expected to see their engineers scrambling, caught in the same weather trap. Instead, she saw a beautifully orchestrated symphony. The Adler Viper dove into the pit box. David Caldwell was standing on the pit wall, holding a physical 2-way radio. He hadn't waited for the computer algorithms. He had watched the sky, felt the drop in barometric pressure, and called his car in the second the first drop of rain fell. Intermediate tires, David's voice commanded, calm and authoritative, cutting through the chaos of the pit lane. The German pit crew moved with terrifying, mechanized precision. In 12 seconds, the Viper was hoisted, its slick tires ripped off, and a set of intermediate tires, a compromise compound designed to survive both wet and dry conditions, was bolted on. As the car dropped, David leaned over the pit wall, locking eyes with his driver through the visor. The grip in Sector 1 and 2 is going to feel loose, Klaus. Trust the aero. The phase change system will keep the tire blankets warm. Attack the rain. Break them. The Adler Viper roared out of the pit box, its engine shrieking into the night, disappearing into the darkness while Victoria's team frantically began hacking away at the ruined carbon fiber of her dying car. Victoria stepped out of her pit box and stood in the rain, the cold water soaking into her designer suit. She looked at David. He was standing on the pit wall, a stopwatch in one hand, staring out into the darkness. The harsh floodlights of the pit lane illuminated the premature gray in his hair and the deep lines of exhaustion on his face. He looked like a general commanding a battlefield. At that moment, Victoria finally understood her catastrophic mistake. She had built a company of Prestons and Richards, men who only understood the world through a screen, men who believed that perfection was a math equation to be solved. David Caldwell was different. He didn't just build the machine, he felt it. He understood that a race car wasn't just a collection of titanium and carbon fiber. It was a living, breathing entity, forged in extreme heat and immense pressure. He had designed an engine that breathed like a lung, that adapted to its environment. He had built his own resilience, his own desperate will to survive, directly into the DNA of the Adler Viper. He wasn't an employee to be managed. He was an artist, and Victoria had thrown a masterpiece into the trash because she didn't like the frame. The KM99 returned to the track 25 minutes later, pieced back together with heavy-duty tape and replacement fiberglass. It was now sitting in 9th place, completely out of contention for the podium, let alone the victory. Victoria didn't go back up to the hospitality suite. She couldn't face the board members. She pulled up a folding chair in the back of the freezing, damp garage, wrapped a team jacket around her shivering shoulders, and watched her empire slowly bleed out over the next 10 hours. By 3 p.m. on Sunday, the sun was high and brutal, baking the damp track into a steaming ribbon of gray asphalt. The grandstands were packed with hundreds of thousands of exhausted, sunburned fans, waiting for the climax of the greatest endurance race in the world. The Adler Viper had not failed. It had not grenaded. The phase change cooling system had run flawlessly for 3,000 miles. The bespoke beryllium V8 had screamed at 10,000 revolutions per minute, lap after lap, hour after hour, a mechanical metronome of absolute perfection. It was currently leading the race by an astonishing 5 laps. It was so far ahead that David had radioed his driver to short shift every gear, effectively putting the car into a Sunday cruise to preserve the machinery for the final hour. In contrast, the KM99 was a walking corpse. It was running on 7 cylinders. The hasty repairs from the midnight crash had destroyed its aerodynamic balance. It was vibrating violently, chewing through tires, and burning oil. It was currently dragging itself around in 7th place, fighting a desperate, humiliating battle just to finish the race. Inside the Adler garage, the atmosphere was a mix of intense focus and premature euphoria. Heinrich Adler had uncorked a bottle of champagne early, pouring glasses for the board members who had flown in from Stuttgart. David, however, remained on the pit wall. He wouldn't celebrate until the clock struck 0. At exactly 4 p.m., the digital timer above the start/finish line hit 24 hours. The official in the flag stand began waving the checkered flag frantically. The Adler Viper rounded the Ford chicane for the final time. The driver, Klaus, began swerving left and right, weaving the matte black prototype across the track in a triumphant dance, flashing the LED headlights at the roaring crowd. As the car crossed the finish line, the Adler Verka garage exploded into cheers. Mechanics hugged each other, weeping openly. Heinrich Adler let out a booming laugh, spraying champagne over his engineers. David took off his headset. He laid it gently on the telemetry desk. He didn't cheer. He didn't jump. He just exhaled, a long, shaky breath that carried the weight of the last 3 years of his life. Suddenly, a small weight slammed into his legs. "Daddy, you won!" David dropped to his knees on the dirty concrete floor, ignoring the oil and the grime, and wrapped his arms around Lily. He buried his face in her shoulder, holding her as tightly as he dared. She was warm. She was alive. She was safe. "We won, monkey," David whispered, his voice cracking, tears finally spilling over his eyelashes and cutting tracks through the carbon dust on his cheeks. "We built the fastest car in the world." Across the pit lane, there was no celebration. The KM99 limped across the finish line 10 minutes later, sputtering and coughing thick black smoke, looking like a wounded animal begging for mercy. Victoria Kensington stood alone at the front of her garage. Her board members had already left, their private jets summoned to take them back to New York to begin the legal process of removing her as CEO. The mechanics were packing away their tools in grim silence. Victoria looked down at her hands. They were trembling. She had lost everything. Her father's legacy, her company, her reputation. It was all gone, erased by a single arrogant decision made in a freezing garage in Indianapolis. She took a deep breath, smoothing the wrinkles in her ruined, rain-stained suit. She stepped out into the pit lane, weaving through the chaos of the post-race celebrations, the hordes of journalists, and the triumphant rival teams. She walked toward the Adler Verka garage. The German security guards moved to intercept her, recognizing the CEO of their defeated rival. But Heinrich Adler held up a massive hand, signaling them to let her pass. David was standing near the rear of the Adler Viper. The car was ticking, the superheated metal finally cooling down. He was wiping a speck of oil off the rear wing with a rag, a subconscious habit born from years of being a janitor. He looked up as Victoria approached. The crowd of journalists around them suddenly quieted, sensing the tectonic shift in the atmosphere. The billionaire CEO, who had lost her crown, approaching the ghost who had taken it. Victoria stopped 3 feet away from him. She didn't look at the car. She looked at David's hands. They were stained with molybdenum grease and brake dust. They were the hands of a creator. "I spent $40 million trying to prove that perfection could be bought," Victoria said, her voice surprisingly steady, though it lacked any of its former venom. "I thought data was infallible. I thought humanity was a liability. David didn't speak. He just watched her, the rag still in his hand. I was wrong, Victoria continued, her gaze rising to meet his. My engineers built a machine. You built a soul, and a machine can never beat a soul. She paused, swallowing hard, the pride finally draining out of her completely. I didn't come over here to congratulate Adler Werke, Victoria said, her voice dropping to a whisper that only David could hear over the din of the crowd. I came over here to apologize to you, David. Not because you beat me, but because when I looked at you in my garage 6 months ago, I didn't see a brilliant engineer, and I didn't see a desperate father fighting for his child. I only saw a man holding a mop. And for that, for my blindness, I am profoundly sorry. You deserved better, and you proved it. David looked at the woman who had nearly destroyed his life. He saw the defeat in her posture, the ruin in her eyes. He could have gloated. He could have destroyed what little dignity she had left in front of the world's press. But David Caldwell was not a man driven by cruelty. He was a builder, not a destroyer. He slowly lowered the rag and offered his hand. The KM-99's block is still structurally sound, Victoria, David said softly. Your aero package is brilliant, but it's fighting your suspension geometry. If you lengthen the control arms by 2 inches and drop the spring rates, it will stop chewing through tires on the banking. Victoria stared at his outstretched hand, stunned. He was giving her the key to saving her car. He was offering her mercy when she had offered him none. Slowly, with a trembling hand, she reached out and shook his calloused, grease-stained palm. Thank you, David, she whispered, a single tear finally escaping her eye and tracing down her cheek. Go fix your car, Miss Kensington, David said, a faint, genuine smile touching his lips. I'll see you on the track next year. Victoria nodded once, turned and walked back toward the Kensington garage, her posture a little straighter, a new kind of determination replacing her shattered arrogance. David watched her go, then felt a tug on his pant leg. Lily was standing there, holding a tiny die-cast model of the Adler Viper that Heinrich had given her. Daddy, can we go home now? She asked, yawning widely. It's too loud. David laughed, a rich, full sound that echoed over the dying roar of the French circuit. He scooped his daughter up into his arms, kissing the top of her head. Yeah, kiddo, David said, turning his back on the cameras, the crowds, and the legend he had just cemented into history. Let's go home. We have a go-kart to build. What a breathtaking journey of redemption, engineering, and the unbreakable bond between a father and his daughter. David proved that sheer passion and human intuition will always triumph over cold corporate arrogance. Victoria learned the hardest lesson of her life, but perhaps it's the exact lesson she needed to truly lead. If you felt your heart racing during that epic showdown at Le Mans, hit that like button right now. Share this video with someone who loves an underdog story, and don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss another incredible real-life drama.